description of what I've done and haven't done. It's very difficult getting up after such an evening. There's been some fantastic stuff that we've all been part of, and I've heard stories tonight which have really impressed me about what people are doing, where we're going and what we're doing. But I'm going to actually probably be a bit of a party pooper in a slight sense at the end, which is probably my role, to sort of stir things up and make you go forward feeling not entirely satisfied with what we've done, but very much aware of what there still remains to be done out there. And because I'm one of these strange beasts known as a 70s feminist, ageing rapidly, I want to just briefly put us back into the things there, because there's lots of things. I mean, I just want to say, I think Diane's done a fantastic job, and I'm not going to go through congratulating everybody who's been congratulated, but just accept this, that tonight's awards are incredibly important because we're valuing an extraordinary amount of stuff that's been done by people. But I also it struck me when I was listening, that what people did, every single woman that stood up here and every single project we described, and I'm sure a lot of other things that many people in this audience have been doing, are about relationships, they're about feelings, they're about people, they're about communalities, they're about belonging into places, they're about being there for other people, they're these full spectrum of what might be our social well-being, our social capacities, our social skills. Every one of the projects related to the fact that it was about our connectivity, about who we were, how we helped other people, and the things we did for other people. These are the feminized sides of our society. This is what makes society work. This is what matters to almost everybody. And yet somehow or other, in this day and age, we don't seem to have come very far in many of the areas that I think are really, in those areas that are very important. In fact, I've been going around and will be for the next few days, since I'm doing a few other International Women's Day things, saying I think in many ways we're slipping backwards. Because we need to actually think about where we were. And in the 1970s, we actually avoided the term feminist. I was reminded recently by Germaine Greer, because we thought feminists were a bit too reformist and slow in doing things. I mean, they got the vote in 1901, but they hadn't done an awful lot by the 1970s. So the second wave movement sort of picked things up and decided what we wanted to do was to change the world. A lot of younger women get very confused these days, and I tell them about, I can't remember if it was a badge or a t-shirt we had which said, any woman that wants to be equal to men has a very low level of ambition. And it actually was said in dead seriousness, because we wanted to change the world. We did not want to become surrogate men. We did not want to take a phrase out of Diane's thing, to perform masculinity. We wanted to bring those areas of life that are really important to us, which is relationships, emotions, feelings, belonging, care, all of those things, and put them on the same agenda and make them as valued as making money and making war, which seem to be the other two things that are actually part of a much more macho version of the world. Yet here we are 40 odd years later, and we really have not made all that much progress in those areas. In fact, I think, if you think about it, we are in many ways a much more macho society, particularly in workplaces, than we were in the 1970s. Even though we have far more women in the workplace. I remember debates in the 70s, and there's a few grey hairs around here. How many people here can remember when we went from the 40-hour week to the 37.5-hour week to the 35-hour week, more or less, for a lot of people? And there were really alarmist programs on the radio and various other places saying, what would we do with our leisure when technology took over and made more time and space for us to do other things? And suddenly all of that disappeared. Now, much of that was really important to what we were trying to do with women's liberation, women's movement in the 1970s. Because one of the ways that we would create a better society was by giving everybody more time, not only to be a paid worker, but to do the unpaid work, to be part of the community, to care for people, to be involved. But somehow, strangely enough, over the next decade or so, we actually increased our working hours. Went straight through to the late 90s, the weekly hours increased for full-time workers. We got a lot of part-time workers, but guess what? Part-time workers are not really serious workers. If you go to work and start talking about flexibility, oh dear, one of them If any man has the impertinence to ask for flexibility in part-time work, he's a bit of a wuss and he's not really serious. We still have workplaces that are incredibly macho. In fact, more so, I think, in many ways than they were, even though we've got many more women into those positions. Because long hours are regarded as good. Now, there's an interesting statistic I was quoting to Prue later, and hopefully they'll pick this up, which is the country in Europe which has the highest per hour productivity is actually Holland, which has the shortest working week. Maybe working shorter hours is actually more productive than hanging around at work trying to prove you're really a good little worker and avoiding going home and putting the kids to bed. I've always reckoned it was pretty much a male plot, because if they actually stay at work, all the women, I always had this little story I used to tell about, women and men, husband and wife get up in the morning, he shoots off to work early, she's still trying to iron the sports uniform, organise the lunches, rapidly rush up some Anzac cookies because she'd forgotten about the, bring a plate day. Drops one kid at childcare, drops one kid at school, goes off to work and breathes a sigh of relief that once at least the work for a while is actually straightforward and you can know what you're doing. Rushes out at 5:30 or 4:30, she's got to pick up the kids, does the shopping, drops off the medicine to her mother, gets home, does the washing, cooks the dinner, gets the kids ready for bed, puts the dinner on the table, and he walks in and she says to him, "Gee, you've had a long day." Now, I still keep telling that story because I think it's about time. It's made quite a few women realise that they had the long day, that sitting at work from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. is probably a bit of a joke compared to trying to work within all the household stuff. So what I'm saying is, I think the dream that we had to change the world somehow or other got dissipated during the 1980s and the 1990s. And one of the things that happened in those days is that we moved from living in a society to living in an economy. Somehow or other, the only things that seem to count these days is your paid job. The fact that you do an awful lot of unpaid work, which most of the people doing things here tonight are doing it on, doesn't get valued by society, doesn't get valued by the government in many cases, apart from giving you the odd prize and nice award and saying nice things about you. But basically, we're expected to sort of contribute through the financials. The minute you raise something and call it a women's issue, you put it together with a whole lot of other issues and it gets downvalued. I mean, I've heard journalists say, "Oh, we can't do anything on domestic violence because we did something on childcare last week." There's that sense that if you're talking about women, that we're a minority category that needs to be sort of talked about in minority ways. So I think it's time that those of us that call ourselves feminists, and those of us who are too scared to call themselves feminists because after all they do shave their legs or do something terrible to their underarm hairs, and that disqualifies them, and they don't hate men, neither did we, but never mind, that's another change. We argued about it passionately because we came from many different sort of political viewpoints, but we worked collaboratively together, we put up alternatives and we got a lot of them up. When we started individuating the whole thing and started worrying about whether we got more women on boards, which doesn't necessarily change what happens in boards, or into senior management positions under the assumption it would change. And when they allow us to be part of it, in many cases we're not allowed to talk too much in case we get labelled and regarded as difficult. So I think we've got a long way to go, and I think we need to really start thinking again about how we get together and start making political change. But the one thing that's missing now, that was very much part of the 70s, is optimism. Most people don't think we can change things, which is one of the reasons that most young people are quite happy to go out and have a demonstration, but when it comes to actually doing the hard work of thinking up the alternatives, they're not happening. So I think we need to actually get people to know that there are options, that we can make changes and we can be a good society. I think we have to be fairly critical of too many of our leaders now who ignore the good social relationships and things that make life worthwhile. And let's put them back on the agenda. Let's argue about how we get there, but let's give everybody the hope we can live in a better society, because I think we all deserve it.